Welcome, everyone. Jose Niño here with another episode of El Niño Speaks. Today, I have back on Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson. It's been nearly 2 years since we last chatted, and a good deal of my audience has grown, and there's going to be a lot of new listeners. So before we start, Dr. Johnson, let them know about your overall background. Give them a brief rundown.
Well, I've been at this and these topics for 30 years. I'm an academic. I got my PhD from Nebraska-Lincoln in the history of political philosophy, of all things. I've taught at many universities, but it doesn't take a genius to figure out I couldn't function there much longer, although I was very popular. My specialty is essentially Russo-Ukrainian, the Russo-Ukrainian world, both historically and today. Lots of stuff on the USSR. I have, I think, 13 books out, and I am full-time. This is all I do. So I function on book sales and things, but also on donations from my audience. My normal show that I lecture once a week, is on Radio Albion. The founder of that went to prison for hate speech in Britain, but he's out now. I have 2 shows on there, actually. And because I'm the only person with my full name, searching for me is very easy, and it'll bring you to everything.
All right. I think that your focus here on Russo-Ukrainian relations is quite relevant to what we will discuss, because when you look at the present Russo-Ukrainian war, even though it is obviously a recent event, you do see some continuity in terms of the historical and culture encounters, namely how in the U.S. and even the broader West, you see a good deal of people, especially in the elite foreign policy decision-making circles, tend to be people of Jewish extraction that have family and ties that go way back to not just Eastern Europe, but also Russia and Ukraine. And just to start this off, when did the Jewish people start settling these parts of the Russo sphere?
They were deliberately, beyond the Khazar Empire, which was crushed in the early Middle Ages by the princes of Kiev, although they were weakening before then. They then became the Ashkenazi. They spread all over. There's very good evidence for this. But they were specifically brought in by the Polish elite at the end of the Middle Ages to serve as middlemen, to serve as creditors, to serve as property managers. And it was a way to make money and keep the monarch weak, which was a central focus of the oligarchs of the Polish Empire. When the Polish Empire collapsed at the end of the 18th century, you had the famous partitions. Russia then came into a good chunk of Polish territory, many Orthodox there, but also a huge number of Jews. So by 1800, something like 70% of the world's Jewish population was now living within the Russian Empire. And from then on, it was nothing but trouble. As indulgent as the Russian state was back then, right up until the revolution, they were given privileges. They tried to assimilate them. They tried to, only a grand total of something like 70,000 Jews ever converted to Orthodoxy, but they tried to make farmers out of them, which is, they were quite naive. Now, there were plenty of Jews in medieval Russia, in Kiev. Again, same problem, same complaints, same issues. But in roughly our modern era, it was the Polish partitions that brought a huge number of Jews in. So on the one hand, Russia saw many new trading opportunities. But on the other hand, it caused a huge amount of problem. And I don't know if you know this, I think you do, but Peter Kihonius and I are doing a very close reading of Solzhenitsyn's 200 years together on his channel, which is going very, very well. So a lot of these issues in tremendous detail we're covering, because we're going through the entire book. We're already at episode 22, and we're at page 100 and something out of 600. So So that audience is also growing. So we're covering a lot of the same things. But that's the nutshell answer to your question.
Let's go back here. You mentioned the Khazars. Who were the Khazars and how do they relate to the Jewish settlement of like the Russosphere?
The Khazar Empire was an early medieval formation on the Volga. It was a Turkic population at first, but Jews migrated there from two sources. The first was from the Persian Empire. They helped foment a revolution there that failed. The second, and actually the first Jewish state, was carved very briefly out of the Persian Empire. We're talking very late 8th century. And also a handful of the wise sages from the Byzantine Empire who had left, and they converged on to the Empire of Khazaria, very strategically located on the Black Sea, the Caspian, the Volga. There was a lot of money to be made there. And slowly, Jews began growing in numbers, but then suddenly both Bulan and his son Obadiah staged a coup and used their money to take over the government. From there, they penetrated the elite. Essentially, there were two governments. There were the Jewish elite, the Kagan, and then the the emperor was a Turkic figure who had no power and would kind of he was under heavy guard, would come out once a year. People could see him. But so it was a semi-secret state, but excavations, thanks to the work of Lev Gumilev, who was one of us in the Soviet Union, he personally did it, found how deeply it penetrated our society, burial patterns and all your typical archaeological things. Exactly how deep it went, no one's 100% sure. A lot of Arab traders at the time say that the elite is completely Jewish. So it was a Jewish state for the most part. And they became fabulously wealthy, but they also were extremely vicious. They were the slave trading center of Eastern Europe. The Slavs, the Russians especially, would raid or have others raid and take slaves, and they would be sold on the island of Kaffa, which was this is exclusively Jewish trade. And eventually, under Svatoslav, it was smashed. And the empire functioned essentially on charging tolls to get from points north to points south on the Volga. You had to pay. They used mercenaries to fight. There was really no ethnic unity there. In fact, the Jews thrive on chaos, and that was the same thing there. But ultimately, it was an unsustainable system. It was known in Western Europe too. They were known for being vicious in combat. No rules of war, not even in a medieval sense. And I have many papers out on this, citing some of the saints of the West, talk that these people are the harbinger of the Antichrist. And Khazars were fairly well known in the West, unfortunately not well known to us.
So were Khazars is effectively a Judeo-Turkic type of ethno-religious group?
Yes, that's precisely how I would say it. And that combination of traits created essentially a new ethnic group that we call the Ashkenazim, and which means that they don't really have any connection, I think you all know this, to either the Old Testament theologically or the Middle East genetically.
Interesting. Because I was always under the impression that the so-called Ashkenazim settled mostly around the Rhineland and northern France, and they kind of moved their way up to Eastern Europe. But you would say the Ashkenazim have more of their origins in the steppe instead?
That would be the case around the Caucasus Mountains. They went where they can get away with what they do. They were kicked out of a million places. I don't want to call it eventually their headquarters became Constantinople or Istanbul, but only under the Turks. And they had this, eventually, as the Middle Ages wore on, they had a tremendous trading network where liquidity, money would travel. The Italian city-states, parts of Northern Europe, Britain, but that came a little bit later, Southern France, and post-Khazaria, The language was not Hebrew anymore. It was always a struggle with them. They eventually spoke with, what they call gutter German at some point. But it wasn't until the Polish elite brought them in that they found a home. This was the paradise of the Jews, as they called it at the time. Utter, complete, and total domination, to the point where even by 1600 or so, they thought that because we dominate this empire so extraordinarily, financially speaking, that the Messiah is coming. That's the level of domination. This has to be a preface to the Messiah coming, and instead of the Messiah, they got Bogdan Khmelnytsky in his revolution of 1648 that destroyed so much of the Jewish elite at the time. They reconstituted.
What sparked that revolution?
Things kind of went back to normal. Oh, Jewish behavior. As time went on, and this is the case everywhere, they were in control of taxation. They were tax farmers. They had a monopoly on liquor and all the disasters that come from that. That was a constant complaint in Eastern Europe. They were organizing the Kahal system, which was also unique to Eastern Europe, although there's variations of it, but that was a specifically Eastern European.
What is that concept exactly?
It was a system of Jewish families, a state within a state. It was ruled by an elder council. They didn't speak the language. They didn't speak Polish. They didn't speak Russian. They were complete and total aliens. Later on, the so-called Jewish Enlightenment, that they started speaking German and things like that. They didn't even have last names back then. So they all seemed to look the same outfit. It was very hard to trace them. So they had this circulatory system around the empire that no one really quite knew who was who. But as they collected more and more debt, as they became greater creditors, they began owning the mills, many of the fields, worked by serf labor. I would say the worst form of serfdom in all of Europe. It was just one step above of slavery. And when they started owning the villages with churches, and then they were charging a huge fee to allow the Orthodox to use them, while allied with the Catholic oligarchy, the Cossack force, which was 100% Orthodox, had enough. A lot of broken promises. They knew what the Jews were. They were the bulwark of the Orthodox Church against the Jews. And Khmelnytsky was not the first, but by far the most successful in creating an Orthodox Ukraine, very different from Poland. And it was for religious reasons, but it was also over the Jews, because they didn't make a huge distinction, nor should they have, between the Polish noble, which Poland was an oligarchy at the time, and their Jewish managers, their Jewish estate managers. Polish nobility was famous for being very frivolous. They didn't have to do much because they had a military function sometimes, but the Jews had handled everything. It was perfect. The Polish nobles were usually in debt. Jews always financed it. They knew they had a solid income here. They were protected in Poland. They took a huge cut and serving as middlemen so that the Polish noble didn't really have to do much. They rarely lived on the estate, and the Jews took care of everything. And so over time, the debt that they were able to collect, both the ordinary person as well as the noble families themselves, was extraordinary. And they may not have owned much of the land, but they absolutely controlled much of the land. And the Cossacks partially came into existence. Actually, their initial purpose was to free Orthodox slaves on the island of Kaffa against the post-Khazar world. That was their purpose. They were like Orthodox bikers of the day. Everything was done on horseback. I mean, everything. They had a state eventually called the Hetmanate. They had the so-called Zaporozhye and Sikh on the very hard to get to. That was their headquarters. And they would raid at different places, but they began to settle slowly. Of course, you're going to come in contact. They were part of the Polish Empire. And Jewish behavior reached a point of misery where they revolted in 1648 for a bunch of reasons, and it was eventually defeated, but it became very difficult. And over the centuries, many other things happened. After that, Ukraine had a brief period of independence, went into what's called the ruin. The Jews eventually reasserted themselves, but there is no way you could talk about the Cossacks in this era. without talking about Jewish behavior. That's what sparked, I mean, technically, Orthodoxy wasn't legal in the Polish Empire, and it was only the force of the Cossacks that led to a certain level of tolerance there.
What you mentioned about Jews in Poland and just like the broader like Pale settlement, how like they kind of formed a state within a state. Would you say that it would be more accurate to describe that as a ghetto, if you will, like a kind of like ethnic ghetto?
Are you talking about the Pale settlement, or are you talking about the Kahal? Are you, because they're very, very far apart. Pale settlement was a 19th century construct in Russia, about the size of France and Spain put together. It was huge. They had many privileges there. It didn't matter. You want to understand the old Russian Empire. Right up until 1917, it was a huge place. It was tough to get around, and the state's role in enforcing the law outside of Petersburg and Moscow was very difficult. Things were done on the local level, at the commune level, the monastic level, whatever. So the privileges and things, Jews were able to take advantage of that. And even though the peasants were always complaining about the liquor, they used alcohol to ply peasants, to get them to do what they want. This was real. They really saw them as cattle. And the same thing goes for Poland. They had to adjust a little bit once the Polish Empire fell and they became part of Russia. But the complaints against the Jews were always the same, no matter where they go. And the thing about alcohol is that they dominated. It wasn't just they distilled it, they brewed it, but they also ran the taverns. And the taverns is where you had prostitution, white slavery, and anything else they could at the time to corrupt the morals of the common population. Very early forms of pornography in the 19th century. They were doing the same thing in the U.S. much later. The same sort of complaints. The Kahal was eventually outlawed, but I think the important thing is that the Pale settlement was not a place. I mean, they lived wherever they wanted. Enforcing this was very difficult. They didn't pay much in taxes. They did everything in their power to get away with it. They think that the greatest form of oppression, according to the Jewish Encyclopedia, is when they were subject to the draft, which they hadn't been before. And the first big draft dodging movement came from them. It's important to note that they were offered free land. They were even offered free labor, serfs from other parts of the empire that could teach them how to work the land. The concept of working a foreign land is out of the question for them. It was a miserable failure, even though they kept trying to do it. They were in exile. The worst thing, I mean, they despised the Russian monarchy, not so much the Polish one, because it didn't really have one, or not an important one. In the Talmud, you hear about, there was a third Rome, you hear about their contempt for Rome. The force that restrained the Antichrist, the force that restrained usury, the force that restrained the mercantile mind, despite the fact that they were well treated throughout the 19th century. Their hatred of not just the cattle, but its leadership grew and grew and grew. They didn't work. They didn't do much. I think the 10% of the population, of the Jewish population, was doing anything constructive. That was in the liberal professions like lawyers and whatever. Everything else was essentially like organized crime. Shakedowns, what we would call shakedowns, alcohol peddling, smuggling from the border. Yeah, they were a state within a state. And initially, say the early 19th century, it was the Russians were very naive. A lot of Gentiles are. And coming across this for the first time in a long time, there weren't many Jews prior to that. They thought they were just kind of normal people. And they were not. And they tried to make them into normal people. And they failed. And despite the fact that they did very well financially and everything else, they nursed this hatred. And by the 1880s, the terrorist movement, the leftist terrorist movement began. Despite the fact that they were doing well, this is all upper-class Jews who started that revolutionary movement then, land and labor and these other groups. They despised the peasantry, although they claimed to speak in their name. That Russia was doing very well, always did. Industrialization, everything else growing rapidly. and yet they were doing everything they can to destroy the Russian Empire and the monarchy, and they began killing these terrorist groups, which were almost exclusively Jewish, started killing sometimes innocent people, but also low-level bureaucrats. A Jewish group did murder Alexander II, who was the best friend the Jews ever had, actually decreed basic legal equality. They murdered him, although they made sure to get Gentiles to do it. The group itself was mostly Jewish, people like Nathanson and Lieberman, the early revolutionaries and nihilists and anarchists, largely because the Kahal had fallen, and the universities, the university which they were allowed in was a disaster, because that was the nest of these revolutionary movements. Wherever they go, it was just obnoxious, leftist revolutionary behavior. And despite the fact that they were doing very well, they started killing people. Ideologically, no. I mean, but Marxism, I mean, they were on the left, certainly. Marxism functions around the industrial proletariat. Now, as time went on, 1890s, they started moving in this direction. The Jewish Socialist Party, the Jewish Bund, Jewish Labour, all these different groups. And people like Lenin, as they became part of this, noticed that this was a already existing core of violent revolutionaries who believed in things like democracy. They talked about the people. But of course, didn't mean all the people. And then they were shocked when Russians became anti-Jewish. But these groups, Land and Labor, People's Will, all these groups, they would use Gentile killers to disguise the fact that it was a very Jewish organization. The great Lev Tikhomidov, the great monarchist writer, was a member, one of the few Gentiles a part of that group, and he exposed the entire thing and became a monarchist. And I wouldn't go so far as to say they were Bolsheviks. They had used Bolshevik methods, but I think strictly speaking, only when they start targeting the industrial centers in the cities can you call them straight Bolsheviks. I think they had a lot in common, but I want to be strict here when it comes to Marxism. But I keep in mind, the Bolsheviks, the workers were the last thing on their mind. They didn't give a damn about these people. They had no contact with them. They didn't understand them. They were a pretext. And let me explain one thing before you ask your next question. Technically, the proletariat is someone living in the city, was a former villager, and is now cut off from that tradition. This is what the Jewish center, corrupted by alcohol. They're losing their culture. They're working in rough conditions. I mean, although Russian factory legislation was the most advanced in the world under Alexander III, and sometimes they had their families back home in the village. And the Jewish mind said, this is the group of people. If we're going to corrupt anybody, it's not going to be the peasants. It's going to be these people, because they're already cut off. And this is why the so-called proletariat, which is defined as someone who owned nothing, unlike the peasantry, and therefore only had his body to use to rent out to the capitalists for labor. But it wasn't so much the economic matter. It was the condition of their life in the cities, cut off from the village, that they targeted starting in the late 1880s. Now you start talking about early Bolsheviks, because they were cut off. It was usually just men. Their families were at home. Later on it changed, but because they're alienated here, this is a perfect group of people to go after. That's as far as the Jewish mind ever got to actually. It wasn't economic. It wasn't that they were being exploited. If they could use that as propaganda, it was their condition. And they never had tremendous support in Russia or really anywhere else. Although they usually lied about their agenda. They never said what they really were going to do. Got to have paper after paper on stuff like that. But that's basically what we're, again, a nutshell about what we're talking about here. That's where the difference between Bolshevism and the early anarchists, or so-called agrarians, was. They called themselves, the agrarians sometimes called themselves populists, which is very confusing because they had nothing to do with how we use the word. The populists were these anarchist revolutionaries. And it was more just to cause chaos, to have people live in fear. But petty traders in the cities, many peasants, certainly many in the Orthodox Church were well aware of what the Jew was. But at the same time, having unrest in that part of the empire, in the western part of the empire, couldn't be tolerated because a lot of money was coming in there, a lot of trading was coming in there. And where you get that kind of money, you get a lot of Jews. So the state was in a terrible position. They knew what the Jew, Alexander III most certainly knew what the Jew was. But doing much about it was very difficult because of the income that the state was getting from places like Odessa and Kiev, etc.
Interesting. So what I can gather from what you were mentioning about like the Jews in like Russia, it's very clear from their experience in Poland and Russia that they were like an unassimilable, pretty visible minority group there. And they were either gravitating towards radical politics that went against like the Russian state and like the Russian people. And also from what I've read, it also seems that if they didn't gravitate towards that, they were going towards these weird Jewish religious sects like the ultra-Orthodox or like the Chabad movement. Were there any resurgence of cases of ritual like blood murder or any cases like that in the 19th century with these groups?
There was a smattering. There was a smattering of cases. Of course, by far the more famous was the Belize case, which is 20th century. There had always been a smattering of this, that nothing really was, evidence was always hard to find. The Russian justice system was really no different than anybody else, especially after Alexander II. And the Jews had already had a foothold in the press. They actually created the content of the popular press. The Belize case in the 20th century, I've read on that until I was blue in the face. You have the famous book now by Ariel Toaf. I think it was at Hebrew University or Tel Aviv, where I did a lecture on that, where he says there's some evidence for this. And I found that the case against Belize, which stirred up the Western world, all this propaganda, there was something to it. I think the guy was guilty, but a lot of you, it's difficult. It's not easy. They're very good at hiding themselves. But it is important to note in this regard that because Britain, say from Alexander II on, had the Rothschild family, dominated by very powerful Jews, was a liberal state, very much indebted to them like the Churchill family was, Jews realized that if they get the British Empire riled up about this, the British were sending emissaries to talk to the monarchist bureaucrats about how awful Jews are being treated here. They would make up a story back in London, and how dare you be anti-Jewish? They're wonderful people. They're doing nothing wrong here. You hate them for no reason. And when the British Empire is talking like that, it can be a big problem for you. Russia was a land power. Britain was not. But during these ritual murder cases, there was a huge amount of pressure from abroad to how, well, these are barbarous people. And in fact, it was the Crimean War that started this, our present propaganda that we still are dealing with today, that Russians aren't anti-civilized and barbarians. And this is, Russia didn't lose the Crimean War, contrary to all the myths. But that's where your present Russophobia has its origin. And the Jewish question, especially in Britain, well, it wasn't certainly not the only thing, but was a big part of this propaganda. So it's not just domestic issues when these ritual murder things came up. You had powerful, especially British, but you had others that were bringing pressure to bear on the Russian Empire. And Belize, of course, was found not guilty.
Interesting. Against this backdrop as well, you start seeing the formation of political Zionism. And from the period, say, after Alexander II's assassination up until the Bolshevik Revolution, was Russia's Jewish community more Zionist or more gravitating towards radical leftist politics?
They were more geared towards leftist politics. You didn't have a large Zionist movement at all. However, You had small communities in Germany and in Russia. Probably the first real systematic treatise on it was roughly at this time, what we're talking about, 1880s. It's called Auto Liberation. I can't remember the author now. And that was the first real.
Yeah.
I can't think of who it, but that was the first real in the Russian language, or maybe in any European language, the first real systematic book on Zionism. Later on, the Black Hundreds were formed, mostly in Ukraine. Their point of view was that getting them out of the country and moving them to the Middle East is probably the best option. They didn't want to hurt them. They wanted them out. And so there always was, even in Hitler's day, there was always this strange alliance. Because remember what Zionism was. Theodor Herzl said, and I couldn't believe it when I first read it, there's a reason why Europeans don't like us. I wouldn't like us either if I were a Christian European. We don't belong here. It makes sense that we are like oil and water, no matter where we go. And therefore, we need to work on creating a colony in Palestine. Although it was very difficult given the politics of Palestine. But that was basically like the Christian Socialist Party in Austria-Hungary, very early kind of national socialist kind of movement, same kind of thing. They can't be assimilated. Their young men are moving into the terrorist movement. Their older men are exploiting people, making huge amounts of money. It was very mysterious. What are they rebelling against here? There was none of the major terrorist groups, the actual people who even committed the acts, who were anything but upper class, from upper class merchant family. It had nothing to do with economics. And but again, you had, I don't know the percentage wise, but it was small. And I'm going to say it wasn't really until Hitler in Germany that really began to dominate. We all know Moses Hess tried to combine radical polity. They're not contradictory. There were plenty of Orthodox Jews who were part of the revolutionary movement early on. There's no contradiction there. Ultimately, I think Judaism is a materialist movement, regardless of what their language says. God is an abstraction at best. But you even had, in this period of time, you had Russians talking. You had the phenomenon of all the committees from 1800 on, the Commission for the Improvement of Jewry, the Commission for one after another, all saying the same thing. Nothing ever worked. They recognized what was going on, and nothing was done. We can't do anything. What are we going to do with these people? When the Empress Elizabeth, the only good ruler in that disastrous 18th century, when she had them removed from Russia, they went to her and said, or there are people who were invested with the nobility went to her and said, we're going to lose all this money. We can't, we're in contracts with these people. And she said, you'll live. I don't care. They're exploiters. The important thing to note is only in a very strong monarchy are you going to have, especially a Christian monarchy, or you have enough power there to go over the heads of the oligarchy and to force them to do things. This is why it was Alexander III who created the factory legislation. This stuff had to be imposed because the oligarchs don't do this stuff voluntarily. And the same thing goes for the Jews. But as the years went on, the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century wore on, Jews became more and more powerful, more and more wealthy, had contacts all over the world. It was very dangerous to deal with them for a whole lot of reasons. Remember, Russia didn't even have a prison system. They were forced to. These people weren't killed. They were sent to Siberia, which was not exactly a punishment. They were settled in a private home, and they just usually found their way back. It was a very decentralized empire by necessity. Everyone talks about Russian bureaucracy. It was tiny compared to the bureaucracy of France or Germany. It was tradition and the family unit and the commune. That's where law was to be found and where it was enforced, unless you live in St. Petersburg. You didn't even have a standardized police force. The Jews knew this, took advantage of it, and unfortunately forced the Russians into action. But anything to blunt the force of Jewish perfidy and obnoxious behavior, of course, was called anti-Semitism. And this is why in the Jewish Encyclopedia, Alexander II is actually treated very well. Alexander III is condemned to this guise, as is Nicholas I, because they dared speak out exactly what's going on here. We all know that the Russian monarchy had a tight control over the banking system, over the currency. Inflation was zero throughout the 19th century, despite the Rothschilds' attempt to take control over it. All of this was considered horrible anti-Semitism. And when the pogroms broke out in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, usually it was Jewish groups. They're all very well armed. There was no gun legislation or anything like that. Very well armed guys. They usually started it, and more Russians were killed than Jews ever were. And they began to realize that these pogroms, because we know how the press is going to cover it, these wild, insane Russian Orthodox, they're wicked. They're killing Jews for no reason. This is one of the things that created a revolutionary movement, despite it having nothing to do with Russian behavior. The state had nothing to do with it. The state stopped it. The last thing they needed was unrest. But they created this mythology. They knew it wasn't true, but they still created this mythology among common Jews that they see these animals, unless we stick together, the revolutionary movement to destroy this monarchy who had nothing to do with anything. So the whole myth of the pogroms was created. This is also the first time you hear the number 6 million. That number started coming up in the late 19th century. Pittsburgh Jewish News, New York Times, and the Russian papers talk about the 6 million Jews in Russia that are either imprisoned or going to be killed or are suffering or are dying or whatever it was. All of this mythology developed to create a cohesive revolutionary movement. But still, Jakubinsky came out of the Russian Empire, a Zionist movement, but Zionism didn't have a lot of support at the time. Jews were a state within a state, did very, very well. So they needed something to mobilize not just Jewish opinion in Russia, but Jewish opinion abroad, especially in Britain. And that's what that was. I mean, that's a very complicated, separate issue. But so anyway, this gets very complicated. But that's the situation as far as this goes in, say, the 1880s and 1890s. Although the worst of the pogroms didn't occur until the 20th century.
What generally spurred these pogroms?
Normally, the way it goes, and you see this in Solzhenitsyn's book too, which is very important. There were occasional riots against the Jews in a few cities. They never really amounted to anything. Again, Jews were well armed. They were well organized. Normally, in the 20th century, pogroms came from the Jews attacking. One time it was I think it was in Odessa, in Kishinev. It was a Paschal Easter procession. And they attacked it. Odessa was the unofficial capital of Jewish Russia, and almost still is, right until the late 20th century. And they knew it would spark a reaction. They'd open fire, they'd throw bombs. I've seen leaflets from that era talking about this necessity of causing trouble, of getting a reaction. The so-called Black Hundred, or the Union of the Russian People, again, mostly a Ukrainian organization, because that's where the Jews were, served as somewhat of a self-defense organization. But the reality of it, and the other problem, of course, was murder. After the murder of Alexander II, a major terrorist act somewhere, everyone knew who did it, and it was just a matter, and sometimes they would react. But I guess the so-called worst pogroms, far more Russians were killed than Jews. They usually didn't start it. Jews were better armed than the Russians were. And the Jews began to realize that claiming this terrible persecution was a great way to mobilize the population, mobilize the West against Russia, especially the Crimean nonsense was still going on. And so they usually deliberately started the trouble. When the white government took over in February of 17, their investigative commission also came to this conclusion. They had no reason to support the monarchy. I think Jews were very well aware of it. I think Lenin was very well aware of it. This was, I think, to some extent, some of the ritual murder cases. People had just had enough. This was a dominant group that clearly hated them, and violence is going to break out. And to this day, Jews say they attacked us and they killed us for no reason. We were just minding our own business, and they killed us. This is still the mythology that's taught in every university classroom in America today.
Interesting. One thing I've also observed with regards to the way Jews try to acquire influence politically is that they have their foot in like every door. It's not like they're going all in with like a certain ideological strategy. They try to like embed themselves in as many groups as possible. On the eve of the Russian Revolution, would you say that the like social democratic strains that were going against the Tsar had just as much overrepresentation of Jews among their ranks as like the Bolshevik movement, or was one like much more disproportionately Jewish?
Yeah, I would agree that Jews were to be found everywhere. Jews were making, the very fact that they were making money hand over fist, that so many of the revolutionaries were wealthy or coming from upper class families, tells you all you need to know. Whatever method they thought would do the most harm, they would use. Remember, at its fundamentals, their version, there was always many forms of Christian socialism and the peasant commune. I'm not talking about that. But this materialist, vehemently anti-Christian socialism, Marxism, etc., on the one hand, and of course, their capitalist merchant usury mentality on the other, they're not all that different from each other. None of these ideologies cared about equality. None of them cared about the condition of the workers. You may have had Gentiles who thought that. Nothing in the Soviet history was ever done to alleviate to the condition of labor. In fact, they were worked to the bone infinitely worse than any other capitalist country, right up until the 1950s, with capital that was invested by the U.S. in the Soviet Union. So these aren't really different ideologies. They seem to be. They love this idea that socialism and capitalism are two radically different things, and they're not. And not how they treat people, not how they view the world, not how they view science, production, industry. And they certainly had nothing to do with labor. This proletariat, I've already discussed, was a pretext. They thought it might be a fertile field for them, but it really didn't matter so long as, and you did have Jews who didn't like the terrorism. I'm sure you could find them. You had Jews that didn't like the exposure that they were, and as I said, the Zionists who say there's a reason for this stuff. You had converts to Orthodoxy who said there are reasons for this. It didn't just happen. People hate us for there were all kinds of minorities in the Russian Empire, like the Armenians who did very well. Nothing against them, even though they were considered heretical Christians. It was just this particular group of people. And it was this obnoxious hatred that they had for the Goyim, and using any excuse, whatever they could use to harm, especially more than anyone else, the Russian Empire. Because this was to them the greatest evil. This was the successor to Rome. And if the Talmud, Rome under various names is the evil that Jews have to fight. And Purim, of course, is a big part of that. The concept of this land empire was shifted to different places. So wherever they go, even the Persian Empire, wherever you go, it's the exact same kind of thing. But these ideologies, to the extent that they serve Jewish interests, that ultimately was the only goal. And I think Moses Hess proved that. Bolshevism was just extremely well organized. It was well funded. It was very Jewish. And it was the culmination of all these other earlier utopian ideologies. But yes, Social Democrats actually was the original name of the Communist Party, Social Democratic Labor Party. But I know what you mean. Just your more moderate liberal types. And you had plenty of Russians in the cities, these old former nobles lawyers and everything else who were a part of that, wanted to be like the West, wanted to be like Britain. So, but that's true too. But the younger Jews tended to go to whatever it was that, quote, liberated them. And by liberation, they mean being able to take over the country, and as the Communist Party did, and then in a planned economy, they essentially owned all productive capital. But that's no different from an oligarchy, where it's just a small group of people owning all productive capital.
Yeah, so who's doing the central planning, really? Now, with the Soviet Union, especially once it validates. It's pretty well documented now, especially after decades of sober historical review, that there was pretty significant Jewish overrepresentation from the 1920s up until World War II. And there was like a point too where the Soviets did recognize the state of Israel. But when would you say was what caused eventually like the Soviets to start to throw their lot more with the Palestinians and stand up against Israel and its U.S. patron at the time? Well, what prompted that? Because I've heard I hear a lot from like a lot of Jewish historians that all this talk about Stalin being like an anti-Semite towards the end of his life and all that, but I was always under the impression that under Stalin, they still had like hate speech laws and laws against anti-Semitism. Could you unpack like all of that?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. It went way beyond World War II. Maybe the late 60s, early 70s, that may have been a shift. But the myth that Stalin was anti-Jewish is absolutely outrageous. There's no evidence for it. He surrounded himself with Jews. His whole family married into, well, he was not a Jew. He had Jews everywhere. But the confusion comes in when he began to purge the old Bolsheviks. It wasn't because they were overwhelmingly Jewish. It wasn't because they were Jews, because they were a threat to him. They were good for the so-called revolutionary agitation years ago, but not to run a bureaucratic empire. The fact that they were Jews had no bearing on anything. Jews did very well under Stalin. So you figure you're a typical college professor and you're trying to figure this out. Well, I can't admit that the Bolshevik movement was Jewish. So what else do I have? Either I admit that it wasn't the Jews, it looked like it was a lot of Jews because the old Bolsheviks were Jewish, or I just say Stalin was an anti-Semite. I have no choice but to say the latter. Being a college professor, being a researcher here, it's a thankless task. First of all, they're not allowed to say a whole lot. Talking about the Bolshevik Revolution without talking about Jews is laughable. That's like talking about Tibet without mentioning Buddhism. It doesn't make any sense. You're leaving out a dominant element. But they have no choice. But even now, today, worse, they don't have access to any of this information. Their whole world is censored and sanitized. It's an easy job. It's so much easier to go along. They just Google censored, their libraries or anything like that's going to be removed. They vet people, which is what tenure is. They vet them at the hiring process. But even if they wanted to, they wouldn't know where to go to get this information. Especially if they use Google. Everything, their world, the only thing they know about us is jokes and one-liners. We know them very well, but they don't know us at all. So when they hear this sort of thing being put in an articulate way, it blows their mind and usually ends up in a very angry discussion. But they're very protected from all of this. But can you imagine trying to write a history of the Bolshevik Revolution and not mentioning the Jews? Can you imagine how ridiculous you're going to sound? And that's how, many of these sound. Now, in the Russian language, it's a different story. Talking about the Jews is pretty common. Even in Ukraine prior to 2014, it was very common. So the Jews, they were a dominant part, despite there only being, 3% of the population. They were extremely important to the Soviet Union. But as far as Palestine goes, the Soviets created the state of Israel. The Soviets made the argument before anybody else at the UN, Gromyko, I think it was, talking about how important it is that Jews have their own state. But you consider the condition of the Soviet Union in 1948. They were in really no position, despite the West rebuilding them, they were in no position to have this new client. The U.S., despite not wanting to anger the Arabs, and they did anyway, eventually came to make a much better deal with them than the Soviets did. And so by the 60s, the Soviets saw Israel as something that the Americans could take. It's like an unsinkable aircraft carrier for them. So they then financed Syria and Iraq. So, but initially, it was a Soviet creation. The problem was, and this, Romania always made me laugh, so many Jews were wanting to leave, let's say by the late 60s, and go to Israel that communist countries were losing their bureaucrats. The Jews were so powerful, they had to stop it. That also sounds like anti-Semitism. So for the first time, things like the Jackson-Vanik Amendment in the U.S., for the first time, there were sanctions placed on the Soviet Union. And that was because they didn't want to let any more Jews go. So that was the only time any sanctions were ever placed on them. Sanctions are on nationalist Russia all the time, but Soviet Union, no such thing. But that was the reason why. I also think by the 70s, the investments that the West made, the Russians made in industry were starting to break down. It was older. Heavy industry was always the big thing for the Soviets. The U.S. had, in technology, it was starting to blow them away in the development of computer systems and everything else. It wasn't profitable anymore. And this is when Jews are leaving the USSR and fairly, I mean, Jewry and Andropov was a Jew, leaving the Soviet Union in fairly large numbers. And they did have something to do with the Soviet Union falling a few years later. But ultimately, it comes down to the fact that despite the fact that the Soviets were the first to recognize Israel, armed it via Czechoslovakia, the U.S. was in a much better position, and it was much easier to rule. There is no Zionism unless you control the foreign policy of at least one of the great powers. It was much easier for Jews to rule in the U.S. than it was in the USSR, especially when people were leaving. So that's what it came down to. And it's still going on to this day, even though Russia and the Soviet Union are completely different entities. Putin is very pro-Palestine, has been from the very beginning, is an ally to Syria and Iran. So, but that's just a continuation of the same policy. So it was really easy to pretend that the Soviet Union was anti-Semitic. No, it was nothing of the kind. It was just a matter of geopolitics.
Yeah, I get the impression too that beyond like the Soviet Union's and like the US's like state actions, that really transnational Jewry at that time probably made a conscious decision in the sense that they saw the strong horse, as you mentioned, in the United States by like just seeing like the winds were blowing clear in that direction. Because I always remember this case too with the Rosenbergs in the U.S. You had Roy Cohn, the homosexual Jew that defended McCarthy, who was also Donald Trump's mentor, was the one that like made sure that the Rosenbergs got executed. And a lot of people I've talked to have said that Cohn was very much a really key transitional figure for U.S. Jewry, because he like by executing the Rosenbergs, he pretty much sent like a message to like the American Jewish community. It's time to get on the U.S. bandwagon now, and you use this as your battering ram to secure your interests, not just in the U.S. but also Israel and abroad.
That eventually became known as the Neoconservative movement.
Yep.
The so-called Trotskyites, those who rejected Stalin, those who rejected that development of the USSR, eventually began to hate the system so badly that the only thing during the Cold War that the neocons were right-wing on was the fight against the Soviet Union. They were liberals in everything else. The man who first taught me about the Jewish question, his name was Donald Paul Rosenberg. He's still around. He ran the Russian monarchist, very right-wing National Traditionalist Caucus in New York City. He was a student of Roy Cohn. In fact, he was on Roy Cohn's staff. Roy Cohn also came out against the first gay rights bill in New York City, early 70s, I think it was. Now, to that extent, he was not part of the future for Jews. But now you hear Jews condemning the Soviet Union, where 50 years ago they would never do any such thing. The so-called Great Patriotic War that saved Jewry from National Socialism, that was fading in importance. Israel, New York, Washington became this triangle of Jewish dominance. And the fact that the neocons use conservative in their name is almost deliberately done to cause confusion. And I bet you, and actually Don used to say this, if we trace like people like Irving Kristol, Billy Crystal, Irving and his son, Billy Crystal, we could probably trace their families back to revolutionary Jews. probably going back to the Pale of Settlement itself. It wasn't the Soviet Union that was the problem. It was Russia that was the problem. And that was the case even during Perestroika. They would use stupid phrases like Soviet Russia, which doesn't make sense. Russia was a captive nation within the Soviet system. Mm-hmm. And we can get into that as well. Soviet Russia doesn't make sense. This was not the case. Russia was Stalin, Khrushchev. They were at war. Stalin was Georgian, Khrushchev was Ukrainian. They were at war with any semblance of Russian nationalism whatsoever. Soviet patriotism is it's really hard to, the National Bolshevik, that's really hard to pin down. I don't like it. I'm not comfortable with it. But that was also part of the anti-Zionist movement. It was a desire to be part of the West that led to Perestroika and eventually the collapse of the system, which was on its way out, as we all know. But the Jewish withdrawal from the Soviet Union at that point in time is one of the things that helped. The so-called Russian mafia, which I despise that because they're exclusively Jewish. A lot of these guys were in prison. And when they came out, they formed these essentially now American, Israeli groups, just like the Italians or any other mafia, except there's no enforcement mechanisms against them. The very fact that these guys were in prison means that they had separated 70s, I'm comfortable saying 1970s, not just over Israel, but over the fact that Russian industry wasn't nearly as profitable. And despite the very close trading relationship between the U.S. and Russia and the Soviet Union, the Americans were blowing them away, not in military technology so much, but absolutely in consumer technology, consumer electronics, all this kind of thing. And just like in the Israeli case, they saw where the money is and maybe where the future is, which was bad news for everybody. And then created their own revolution in actual independent Russia in the 1990s, where through oligarchy took over the entire, whatever was left of the productive capital and treated it like their own fief. So you have more than one revolution that was run by Jews. Putin takes over and became very popular by throwing a lot of these guys in prison. That was the first major thing that he was known for. If he would have shot them, he would have been even more popular. They would have crowned him as a monarch. But so anyway, that's where we are. I know we're coming to the end here, but we have covered this huge swath of history actually pretty well. Operation, the same way they think, it's nothing seems to change with them except the country.
Yeah, that's the constant is definitely the Jewish perfidy, but what changes, like you mentioned, is the country and also like the political dynamics, what faction they align with. But that's also a matter of political circumstance, because at the end of the day, you just see the same skullduggery and subterfuge and subversion. It just manifests itself in different forms with the factions that organized Jewry will side with and try to pact with to undermine countries.
Their world revolves around the fact that they are very small in number. Therefore, they have to use every possible method at their disposal to compensate for that. And my God, I wish some more people would do that. It's cohesion matters, organization matters, unity matters, not numbers. And if anybody in the world can prove that, it's been the Jews over the last God knows how long.
Yep. Well, I think this is a good place to end the discussion, Dr. Johnson. But before we leave, let my audience know where they can follow your work.
Probably the best thing to do is to go to Radio Albion, like the other name for Britain, ALBION. And from there, you can get all the information for me that you need. They set up a page for me with a lot of my books and ways to donate on there. And also I have a Patreon where I'm publishing usually that's more current events, maybe 2 lengthy articles a month, mostly on Russian stuff, but on a lot of other things, China, Syria, stuff like that. Sometimes even Latin America, American politics. And I have a decent following there. That would be a great way to support me as well. There's a million things you can do to help out. But because I am full-time, I am very dependent on these methods of support. So I appreciate you helping me out as always.
No problem. And you're always welcome to come back because there's plenty to talk about with regards to these subjects. And to my audience, as usual, thank you again for your attention. And with that, El Niño has spoken.